Can I see the name so I get the translation? The knowledge of God. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي واختياري فدعائي وابتهالي شاهد لي بافتقاري. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي وابتياري فلهذا السر أدعو في يساري وعساري. أنا عبد صار فخري ضمن فقري واضطراري. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي واختياري. يا إلهي ومليكي أنت تعلم كيف حالي وبما قد حل قلبي من هموم واشتغالي. فتداركني بلطف منك يا مولى الموالي. يا كريم الوجه غثني قبل أن يفنى اصطباري. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤال يا سريع الغوث غوثا منك يدركني سريعا. يهزم العسر ويأتي بالذي أرجو جميعا. يا قريبا يا مجيبا يا عليما يا سميعا. قد تحققت بعجزي وخضوعي وانكساري. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي واختياري. لم أزل بالباب واقف فارحم الرب بوقوفي وبوادي الفضل عكف فأدم ربي عكوفي. ولحسن الظن لازم فهو خلي وحليفي وأنيسي وجليسي طول الليل والنهار. قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي. حاجة في النفس يا رب فاقضيها يا خير قادي وأرح سري وقلبي من لظاها والشواظ في سرور وحبور وإذا ما كنت راضي فالهنا والبسط حالي والشعار ودثاري قد كفاني علم ربي لي واختياري فدعائي وابتهالي شاهد لي بافتقاري قد كفاني علم ربي من سؤالي واختياري اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه اللهم انفعنا اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, we have now reached the fourth session in which we will discuss the integrals of enjoining good and forbidding evil from this blessed book within the 40 books of the Iḥyā Ulūm, book number 19 on the Kitab al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf wa Nahi an al-Munkar. And we have spent an extensive amount of time to impress upon ourselves to have the correct conception. And if we don't have the correct conception of something, it is inconceivable that we'll be able to put it into practice in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everything that it is that we do, through knowledge, we have to see things clearly and correctly, i.e. have the correct conception, and then we must also do it. And the two archetypes of going astray, the core archetypes relate to a lack of knowledge or knowledge that then our passions overcome us and we cease to live up to the import of that knowledge. And so again and again, it's inconceivable that you and I will fully fulfill this blessed aspect of the Deen if we don't understand it correctly. And for those that were not here with us last night, we highly recommend that you review those initial sessions And one of the most important things that we discussed was the importance of al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. How Imam al-Ghazali says it is the qutb al-a'zam min al-Dīn. It is the supreme foundation of the religion. And it is the main duty of the prophets. This is what Allah Ta'ala sent them with. And how in reality, and this was a part of our discussion sessions this morning, there's a profundity and a depth to this concept that doesn't come at a surface level understanding or even a translation of it. So when we translate it as enjoining good and forbidding evil, or commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, it's very easy for us to limit the broad scope of its meanings. And so we've spent an extensive amount of time on that, and we hope that that will continue through, because this is always going to remain important. But our specific task for this session is to start speaking about the integrals of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali mentions as part of chapter 2. Chapter 1 was everything that we've discussed until now, and chapter 2 is getting into the arkan. So you could say the integrals, or the pillars, or even that obligations. And so he says here, اعلم أن الأركان في الحسبة التي هي عبارة شاملة الأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر أربعة. So he says that know that the integrals of what he calls now here hisbah. So he's now using a single word to refer to al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. And this word hisbah comes from a root word hasaba yahsubu, and which has several verbal nouns, hasban wa hisban wa husbanan and wa hisbatan, that we use this in the sense of wealth. Hasab al-mal ay adda wa ahsa. It's to literally count money or to enumerate something. And this is where we get the word hisab from. And so in a positive sense, when we talk about muhasaba, yani taking ourselves to account, when we add that extra alif, now there's the action of the verb in relation to someone else. Here, imagine that your own self is someone else. So this is one of the most important things that we can do, is learn this, how to take ourselves to account. And ideally, we should be doing this on a daily basis, throughout the day, but especially before we go to bed at night. What do we do during the day? Take ourselves to account. Did we live right? Yani, the most important aspect of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is on our own selves, even before we even do this with other people. And as we spoke about last night, and that also discussed this morning, our effectiveness in fulfilling this supreme foundation of the religion is only to the degree that we are living its reality first. So if you don't have something, you can't give something. If you're not implementing something, people won't tend to listen to what you're calling to or what you're telling them to do. So in other words, it begins first with our own state. And as that someone so beautifully and eloquently summarized what it really is, this is really about prophetic living. You could speak of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar as prophetic living, learning to resemble the prophets who come to us with teachings wherein which we can align ourselves with the divine will. That's why this is so important. And by upholding this blessed principle of the Deen, you are allowing guidance to continue on earth, and for individual souls to reconnect and align themselves to the way things that are supposed to be with the Lord of the heavens and the earth. So again, these depths don't come across with just a mere translation. And so this word hisbah is a word that can be used coterminously with al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. It's a synonym for it, and it's an easier way to refer to it because Every time you say al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, it's a little bit of a long statement. So you could just say hisba and mean the same thing. And so then when you take it to the eighth form, so that the verb is ihtasaba, it's to actively do the hisba, to actually do the amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. So you have the muhtasab, which is the first of the integrals. This is the one who is actually doing this, the person enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. Then you have al-muhtasab alayhi. Then you have the thing that is forbade, yani the thing that is being censured. Then you have al-muhtasab fihi. Then you have the person doing the wrong. And then you have nafs al-ihtisab, the act of doing this. So these are the four arkan, these are the four integrals. In this session, we're going to focus on the first two. In the late afternoon session, we will do the latter two. And with this, we hope that we'll come out with a working knowledge of this blessed principle of the Deen. Oh, Bakr, go get me my copy of Reliance of the Traveler. I want to mention something from that. I forgot to bring it. I'm going to mention something from that book and point you to a place where you can continue your studies of this. Okay, so let's get right into this. So there's four integrals. We're going to be focusing first on the muhtasab, the person enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. And so this is a fairly technical discussion. And this is going to give us the basis of knowledge that we need. And it's like anything else. And it's no different when you enter into the battleground of life. You have to just know this knowledge because oftentimes we're reacting in very short periods of time. And it's no different than, for instance, if you are training for a sport, for instance, the classic metaphor of someone learning basketball, you are working on your footwork, you're working on your form, you're doing all of these things while you're during practice sessions. And then once you enter into the game, you can't be thinking about anything. If you're thinking about, you have to have your muscle memory take over at that point. And if you think about something, you're going to be off. You have to work on in whatever sport it is and whatever craft really that someone is involved in. You can work on your craft and try to perfect it in practice sessions. But then in the moment, you have to just be able to live it. And so there's times where we learn formally where it's fairly technical. And then the way that we implement it has to be very fluid. And we try to do our best. If we have the ability to deliberate over something, it's good. And this is why our Prophet taught us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at-ta'anni min ar-Rahman wal-ajadu min ash-shaytan. Deliberation or consideration is from the All-Merciful, and haste is from the devil. And this beautiful word ta'anni comes from ana ya'ni, which means to pick fruit when it's ripe. Everything has its right time. And being sources of guidance and transformation of people, there's also a right time to do something. If you pick that fruit too early, it's not going to taste right. If you pick it too late, it might be spoiled. And likewise with our interactions with people. When you tell them something, of course it matters how you say it, but also when you say it. And the time that you say, you have to choose the right time to say something. In other words, we learn these principles in sessions like this where we are actively studying together, but then we apply them in day-to-day life, hopefully with a degree of fluidity, that if we can take time to really consider whether this is something we should do or not, that's great. Sometimes we need to make split-second decisions. And we actually will be faulted for taking too long to actually do what needs to be done. And then we assess ourselves that if we made a mistake, we quickly rectify it and make up for it. But the more knowledge that we have is that the better ability that we will, that the more ability will have to be fluid in applying these principles correctly. So the first thing Imam al-Ghazali speaks about are the shurut al-wujub, the conditions of obligatoriness. In other words, he's speaking of this now as this is something that is necessary in the religion. So you just learned, had 2 whole sessions on this. The wujub, the fadila, and the madhamma of the ihmal. The obligatory nature of this, its virtue, and the danger of neglecting it. And so many of the nusus that you just heard point to its obligatory nature. And of course, in general, as was already said, it is considered to be a fard kifaya, a communal obligation. However, there are times when no one else is able to do it that it will become an individual obligation upon you. And so we need to understand what these conditions of obligatoriness are, so that if it really is obligatory, that's something serious. We're saying that if you don't do this, then Allah Ta'ala could punish us in the hereafter. So this is serious. And anything that Allah Ta'ala says is obligatory is one of the most important things of all. This is one of the great foundations of our deen, then anything that is obligatory. And of all the things that human beings can do, the amount of obligations are actually only a few. The amount of prohibitions are actually only a few compared to all things that human beings can possibly do. So you and I, in relation to those obligations and the prohibitions, have to give them the utmost we have to have the utmost concern for them. So the first condition of obligatoriness is legal responsibility. And what this means is that someone becomes of age, and now they have taklif, and they are taken into account for what it is that they say and what it is that they do. And different schools provide different criteria for this, but in general, it's associated with the onset of puberty, which corresponds to a developmental stage of the intellect, because really the prerequisite is about intellect. But in order to determine that, it's a bit hard, so the Sacred Law says that it corresponds roughly to the onset of purity. But it's really about the aql, having the ability to know right from wrong and to exercise what makes us uniquely human, i.e. our ability to choose. So when someone reaches this state of legal responsibility, this is when it could be an obligation. In other words, if a child partakes in al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, they can do it and they get rewarded for doing so, although it's not an obligation upon them, even though that it's something still good to do. And certainly even a young child at times might correct an adult. And that this is across the spectrum, that something that spans gender, so that anyone legal responsibility, so this is on the shoulders of men, just as it's on the shoulders of women, and this is on the shoulders of all different types of people in society. That once they become legally responsible, this could potentially be on their shoulders to uphold this religious principle. And the next condition is a fairly easy one, and it's the one simply of faith. And so when we speak about this, that what this means is that someone who believes in Islam and is submitted to the teachings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they're the ones that are going to be held accountable for this. And then the third one is the one really where we will have the majority of the discussion. Those first two are fairly clear. Okay? So legal responsibility and faith. The third one, though, is being able to. So mukallafan, musliman, qadiran in Arabic. Right? They're mukallaf, they have legal responsibility, they're Muslim, and then they're qadir, they're able to actually do this. And this is where we can speak in a little bit more detail. So it is a necessary condition that the person condemning something wrong be able to do so. Someone who is unable, and of course so we're going to define that, is not obliged to condemn it except in his heart. And of course, that is the weakest of faith. But this is also where it starts. And this is why someone have taken an alternative interpretation of this blessed hadith. ذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ indicates the multiplied reward for disliking what is wrong in your heart. Because if it doesn't start at the heart level and you don't have a conscience that is alive and that filled and illuminated with the light of the sacred law and the light of wanting to live like the prophets, you're likely not going to say anything with your tongue or try to change anything with your hand. So they go hand in hand. Yes, is that the outwardmost dimension of that, changing things with our hand, is part of it. Saying things with your tongue is part of it. And that if you can't do those two things, yes, you still have to dislike and hate wrong in your heart. But at the same time, it's only to the degree that you really dislike wrong and hate it in your heart that you will actually try to do something about it outwardly. So they go hand in hand. And this is very important because when we look out in the world, any wrong that we see happening in the world, and this is a test for us in our time, living in the world that we live in, we are so much more aware of other people's problems in the world than people were in previous times. Think about it. In a previous time, the only way that you would know that something's wrong is by hearing someone tell you a story or a letter that someone writes or seeing something right before your eyes. And certainly people saw horrific things with their eyes, but you're not going to be that much aware of what's happening in the rest of the world. If you are, it's slightly detached, as opposed to now that seeing that Instagram videos of people being burned alive, which is very difficult for the human being to bear. We live in a very difficult time that we're so exposed to so much evil in the world. This is one of the reasons why so many people have that left religion altogether. Now, of course, for us, that we've never framed it as a problem of evil. We've understood from the time that the angels that realized that what was going to happen with Bani Adam is that there was going to be a lot of problems, but there's also a sir, there's also a secret. And human beings being here on the earth and being the khulafa of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So anyhow, the whole point here is we have to have hearts that are alive. And if there's something that we're unable to change, we have to condemn it in our heart. And here there's something very important we need to know. Be very careful of becoming desensitized. And that video that I was just mentioning, I was eating some crackers. And then as soon as I saw that, how can you even eat? It's very hard to function in life when you see these things. How can we just go on to the next thing in our feed after you just, okay, next video, and then you see these ridiculous cultures that are a sign of this zeitgeist that we're living in. And how can we just keep scrolling down and looking at other stuff? These things, right, requires if someone sees something like that to turn to Allah Ta'ala, pray 2 rakats, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help the ummah. But at very least is that we have to hate wrong in our hearts. This is a part of the worship of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And there are plenty of things that are wrong in today's society. But don't become desensitized to this by overconsumption. And so be careful how much we allow to enter into our hearts through primarily the senses of our eyes and our ears, through our social media feeds. So it is a necessary condition that the person condemning something wrong be able to do so. Someone who is unable is not obliged to condemn it except in his heart. But again, this is that a part of faith, even though our Prophet said, al-Iman, the weakest, but it's a part of faith. And we live in a time where it's very dangerous because people are not only not calling to good and forbidding evil. And this is a hadith that Imam Abdul Mubarak mentions, is that there are people who have the wrong conception where they see good as evil and evil as good. So they see munkar as ma'ruf and ma'ruf as munkar. And then when you see evil as good and good as evil, our time is one of people are doing amr bil munkar and nahy anil ma'ruf. Muslims, I'm not talking about other people. You expect this from people who don't have the same faith as you. But there are Muslims who are doing amr bil munkar wa nahy anil ma'ruf, which is really serious. They're commanding the evil and forbidding the good. And this is done in very subtle ways, because when you say it like I'm saying, it seems so obvious, and you're like, oh, how could anyone ever do this? But this is done in very subtle ways. And when things seep in where your whole conception of religion starts to change, you don't even realize that you're doing it oftentimes. And bid'ah is sweet to the people who actually do it. It's sweet to them. They think that they're on truth, or else they wouldn't be doing that. So, the obligation is not only lifted when physically unable, but also when one fears that problems will result for one, which also comes under the heading of inability. So just hang in there. We'll get through all of this. And there'll be very clear definitions of what this all means. So the obligation is not only lifted when physically unable, but also when one fears that problems will result for one, which also comes under the heading of inability. So the first bit is that you see someone attacking someone unjustly, but you don't have the physical strength to actually even get up and to help that person. There's nothing that you can do then. You just have to dislike that in your heart and try to do something else to help them. Okay? But also that if there's a fear of problems, the obligation to censure the wrong is likewise lifted when one knows that the reproach will be ineffective. So these two things are very important. Is that you're unable to because you fear that there's problems, or that even if you would say something that it won't work, it will be ineffective. Now, what we're talking about here is the lifting of the obligation, not necessarily whether we should still do it or not. We're talking about the lifting of the obligation. So there's three things here. You're physically unable, or you feel like that it will cause problems, or is that you feel that in doing so, no matter how you do it, it's going to be ineffective. Now, in the afternoon, we're going to talk about the 8 stages of it. So that's coming. So 4 situations may be distinguished with respect to this. When one knows the wrong will be eliminated by speaking or acting without this entailing problems for oneself, one is obliged to censure it. So you see a wrong. Now, what we're not really going into here yet, this is coming in the next bit of this, is we're just assuming wrong is wrong. Okay, we're not talking about what the wrong is. That's actually the next integral, is the muhtasab alayh, the thing that we are actually forbidding. So that's coming. So you see this actually, it gets a little bit complicated, but it's not too hard. We're all going to get this bi'idhnillah. So 4 situations. When one knows the wrong will be eliminated by speaking or acting without this entailing problems for oneself, one is obliged to censure it. Okay, that's the most clear example. Number 2, when one knows that speaking will be ineffective and one will be beaten if one does, one is not obliged to. So you see someone doing something wrong. You walk down the street in your neighborhood and there is a Muslim who's holding a beer and openly drinking beer right in front of the community. And you know that this is a habit of this person, And if you say anything, it's not going to work because you know this person. And you actually fear that this person will actually attack you, were you to even call him out. So with those two conditions, you're not obliged to say anything to this person. But as you walk by, you have to hate that in your heart. And unfortunately, this is things that you see. Like, I've seen people that come from very conservative Muslim countries. As soon as they get on one of these planes outside of the country, just order alcohol from the flight attendant. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Right? Or you'll see people that they start on the plane with a hijab and a full abaya, and then once the plane takes off and they get close to landing, like, where did it go? Total change. Or the opposite. That just before they land, because they're going home to their conservative country, all of a sudden it all comes back on. So these are things that are very practical situations where that we will be exposed to. So that's the second scenario. The third, when one knows that one's censure will be ineffective, but it does not entail problems for one. Okay, so you know that this is not really going to help if I say this. But the person, it's not going to lead to any problems. It is not obligatory. Why? Because of its ineffectiveness. Though one is still recommended to censor the act as in order to manifest the standards of Islam and remind people of their religion. So here, it's not obligatory, but it's recommended. And again, we'll have to just be patient. We're going to get to the stages. We don't just jump to the higher stages when there's something else we can do. Then number 4. And when one knows that it will cause problems for one, but the wrong will be eliminated by censoring it. Okay, so this is the other way around in number 3. So you know it's going to be effective, and it will eliminate, but you know there's going to be problems that come your way. Such, and he gives examples of doing it, is that then one is not obliged, but recommended to do it. Even if it brings about harm. It lifts the obligation, but it's still recommended to do. And usually the people that tend to do that are the people who care the most and have a beautiful state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they don't fear the lawmat al-la'im. They're not worried about being blamed. They're not worried about being disparaged and what people say about them. So then he says here, so those are the 4 situations. And hadiths that seem to show the non-obligatoriness of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong are understood by Islamic scholars as referring to specific situations in which censure is ineffectual and are not global statements about the obligation's inapplicability to a certain era of history, such as our own or some future time. Commanding the right and forbidding the wrong will be obligatory until the day of judgment. So this is really important. This was just taken, one of the first hadith that you took today with Ustad Amjad. And let's look at this so we can explain the proper context of this. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that says in his book that alaykum anfusukum, that be concerned about your own selves. La yadurru man dalla idha ihtadaytum. That ya yadurruka man dalla idha ihtadaytum. You will not be harmed by those who go astray if you are guided in and of yourselves. And then the blessed hadith of our Prophet ﷺ that came as a result of this learning, that command the good and forbid the bad, hatta, until. So when our Prophet's saying this, is that this is how you should be, but you're going to have a different response now when you see the following. حتى إذا رأيت شح مطاعا وهوى متبا ودنيا مؤثر وإعجاب كل ذي رأي برأيه. In those situations where you see people, that avarice that is obeyed, desire that is followed, the world that is preserved, and everyone just being impressed with their opinion. فَعَلَيْكَ يَعْنِ بِنَفْسِكَ. Our Prophet himself said that be concerned only with your own self, وَدَعْ عَنْكَ الْأَوَامِ, and leave the general affair of people. And then our Prophet went on to say that there's a time that is coming that our Prophet said, أَيَامَ الصَّبْرِ, the days of patience. Patience in those days is like holding on to a hot coal. But then look what our Prophet did. He opened up the door for us still, not to despair. لِلْعَامِلِ فِيهِ مِثْلُ أَجْرِ خَمْسِينَ رَجُلًا. Someone who acts during that time, i.e., does what he can in the most difficult of situations where it doesn't seem like you can have much effect on society outwardly, that will have the reward of 50 men that do the likes of his acts among you. And who's the Prophet ﷺ speaking to? The companions. And there's other indications that in a hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, "Man ahya sunnati and fasadi ummati." Whoever brings my sunnah to life when my ummahs become corrupt, فَلَوْ أَجْرَ مِيَةْ شَهِيد. You will have the reward of 100 martyrs. So the next hadith is, as our Prophet also said, and this is an example, because this is very important that we understand this. إِنَّ بَيَّدَيَ السَّاعَةِ فِتَنٍ قَدْ قَطَعَ اللَّيْلَ الْمُظْلِمِ. Before the hour, there will be tribulations that come like the successive darkness of night. يُصْبِحُ الرَّجُلُ فِيهَا مُؤْمِنًا وَيُمْسِي كَافِرًا. نَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ الْعَافِيَةَ. A man will enter into the morning as a believer and by nightfall have left the religion. وَيُمْسِي مُؤْمِنًا وَيُصْبِحُ كَافِرًا. At night he will be a believer, but by morning he will have left the religion. But then what did our Prophet say? الْقَاعِدُ فِيهَا خَيْرٌ مِنَ الْقَائِمِ. The one is sitting is better than the one standing. وَالْقَائِمْ فِيهَا خَيْرٌ مِنَ الْمَاشِي. The one sitting is the better than the one walking. وَالْمَاشِي فِيهَا خَيْرٌ مِنَ السَّعِي. The one walking is better than the one running. فَكَسِّرُوا قَسِيُّكُمْ وَقَطِّعُوا أَوْتَارَكُمْ. Break your bows and cut the bowstrings. وَضْرِبُوا سُيُوفَكُمْ بِالْحِجَارَةِ. Break your swords on rocks. These are the words of the Prophet ﷺ. فَإِن دُخِلَ أَحَدًا مِنْكُمْ. If someone comes to harm you or to attack you or to take your life, فَلْيَكُنْ كَخَيْرِ إِبْنَيْ آدَمَ. Be like the better of the two sons of Adam. Meaning the one who that didn't show that aggression and take the life. So this is really important. There's no doubt from the earlier period and in different places throughout Islamic history, and increasingly the closer and closer we get to time, there will be instances where we have to put this prophetic guidance into practice. What the Sheikh is saying here is that this doesn't mean that there's not still circumstances where you can uphold this blessed principle of Amr ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. So it's not like a blanket statement like, no, our time is, there's nothing that you can do. No, even if you're in a difficult time like this, people that are in your direct circle of influence, your own family members, that your extended family, your friends, people that you know, there's still oftentimes things that you can do. Now, there might be certain people that you can't reach. So there's countries right now in the heartland of the Muslim world where you simply cannot do this. Where there's great scholars who are sons of great scholars who have signed an agreement with the government that even if they're invited over to someone's house for lunch, they cannot speak about religion. People banned from traveling, that gatherings of any sort banned. In the heartland of the Muslim world right now as we speak, and not just in one place. We're in khair. We have to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessing of being able to come together like this and learn our deen. This is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are people that, were they to actually say anything and criticize, then they very well might be imprisoned, or even worse, something very serious could happen to them. And so these ahadith apply to those situations, the people that are in them. So this is like, we could be in one place, and here we have more freedom where we can say certain things. We can be very critical of the political establishment. We can be very critical about their positions and their support of things like the genocide. And we should be, if we can, just as an example, just as we can also be very critical of other people's practices. We have a freedom to do so. So the responsibility on our shoulder is greater because of the freedom that we have. But if we live as a Muslim in another country, we might not have that freedom. And something very bad could happen to us or our families. And if that's the case, then we have to take a different position. And so we have comprehensive guidance from the Sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ. And even if we're in those situations where there's nothing we can do publicly, we still have to rear our children in the correct way. And then you've had that situation in Islamic history where people have had to completely hide their Islam. Completely. And not the so far distant past. And so may Allah Ta'ala that make things easy for the ummah of our Prophet ﷺ and the suffering that it's endured that throughout the centuries. And the only way to understand that, whether it's in the near past or the far distant past, there's been a lot of suffering that throughout time for human beings. And there's been a lot of suffering within the ummah of our Prophet ﷺ from the early period. But we believe in a Lord who's just. And we believe that none of this is going to be in vain. And if we die in the right state, no matter what happens to us, what's going to happen in the eternal hereafter will be good for us. And ultimately, this is an ummah marhuma. We always have to remember that. This is an ummah that will be shown mercy to. And our Prophet is the Nabi ar-Rahman. He's the Prophet of mercy. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So we wanted to make that point clear. Is that we want to be careful by saying these blanket statements like in our time, no one's going to listen. Like no one, not a single person? Yes, in general, the vast majority of people around us don't understand what it is that we're doing. They don't understand our religion. And that even the vast majority of Muslims that we're living with in America, what percentage of Muslims in America actually even pray? What percentage of Muslims in America actually even go to Jummah? What percentage of Muslims actually even do the basics of their deen? So we need to understand the time that we live in, but at the same time, not fall victim to blanket statements that might make us lazy and not do what it is that we can do. We're required to do what it is that we can do in the right way. And we also have to be careful, because if we look at some other examples of other religious people that are outside the fold of Islam, that have other beliefs, sometimes the ways that they speak about the realities of their beliefs based upon their own religion, we have to be careful not to fall into some of these traps. And whether it's the trap of tying ourselves to a political party, or whether it be that tying ourselves to certain political positions, or tying ourselves to certain issues and ways that we deal with those issues, right? And that something like abortion in the United States of America is a classic example of that. We need to look around and see how sometimes that other people of different religions are doing certain things that strategize what is the very best way that we can uphold and live this supreme foundation of the religion in our time in a way that is consistent with its principles, but also wherein which our hands are metaphorically extended for those who want to come taste the sweetness of this faith that we have. So, having said all of that, that the four situations that were mentioned are a summary of how we need to understand this. But there's a few other points here that need to be mentioned in this regard. If one wants to censure something but knows it will result in one's companions also being beaten or harmed, it is not permissible for one to do so because one is incapable of removing one blameworthy thing without its leading to another. Okay? So, not only when we're physically unable, and not only that we fear that problems will resort for us, but also when we think it's going to be ineffective, but the nuance there when we fear problems. If we fear problems for our own self, there's certain situations where it's still recommended, but not if we feel that it's going to lead to a greater harm that affects other people. Do you see where we need wisdom? And how we really need to think about the things it is that we do. Is it something affecting just me? That's fine. But if they're going to target your family then, they're going to target your friends, they're going to target your community, you have to think twice. At that point, it becomes haram for you to say anything. Haram. Even if they're the ones doing wrong. Because you're setting up a situation in which people are going to be harmed. There's going to be a greater harm than the harm that was initially there that you're trying to speak out against. It is not lawful to censure anything reprehensible. When doing so, will lead to a thing or state that is more reprehensible. So you also see why we need to have an in-depth knowledge of the waqi', the way things are in reality. We need to consult people. We need to consult elders. We need to consult scholars. We need to consult specialists, people that have experience and in-depth knowledge so that we can develop an approach that is consistent with our principles. Now, a couple other clarifications here. When we use this word know, so we've said when one knows the wrong, when one knows that speaking, when one knows that one's sincere. Know here only means what one believes will probably result. It doesn't mean you have certainty. This is what you believe will probably result. And so there's an error, and Imam al-Ghazali actually goes into a lot of depth here, which we don't have time to get into. He says some people by nature are very courageous. Other people by nature that lack courage. And so what he says is we take on average, what is a normal person? How do they assess this particular situation? That's a detail there. But in the end, ultimately, you and I have to prepare a response on Yawm al-Qiyamah. We should always prepare a response that if I'm asked by the Lord of the heavens and the earth on the day of judgment, what stance I took or what stance I didn't take, what I did or what I didn't do, that's the most important thing of all. Prepare your response, and you cannot fool Allah. So we have to look very carefully into ourselves. Am I more of a coward or am I more of a courageous person? Do I tend to just shun conflict or am I actually conflict driven? Or am I somewhere in the middle? And make sure that you don't overcompensate at the same time for a weakness or a strength that you have, but try to remain in the middle. And so that you bring to mind that, Ya Rab, I'm going to be asked on the day of judgment about this particular situation. What did you do, or why did you do what you did, or why did you not do something? We have a response. This was it, Ya Rab. And we want that to be that stem from knowledge. Okay? So know only means what one believes will probably result. Someone who thinks that it will create problems for him is not obligated to censure, though someone who does not believe that problems result is obliged to. Cowardice does not enter into consideration here, nor foolhardy courage, but rather the normal temperament of someone with a sound disposition. And then problems means being beaten, killed, robbed, or acquiring a bad name in town. These are the 4 areas that it refers to, primarily. So that create problems for yourself, someone that could physically harm you, right? Right? So someone just like pushing you is not like you actually feel someone is going to actually really beat you. And that there's degrees of being beaten, of course. And obviously, if you fear someone taking your life, that's a given. But you fear something bad happened to you. They're going to rob you, or they're going to that steal your car, or something like this. Then that's considered. Or that they're going to tarnish your reputation in a way that would make you difficult to that interact in a normal way in the society in which you live. They're going to tarnish your reputation. Because in the end, what only matters is what Allah Ta'ala thinks of us. But preserving our reputation is something the Sharia encourages us to do. Because if someone doesn't have a good reputation, it's hard for them to get married. It's hard for them to do financial transactions. It's hard for them to do things that you need to do in a functional, normal society. So insofar as so to the degree that we preserve our reputation such that it is needed to do basic human transactions, this is a good thing. And then beyond that, we don't worry about things. And preserving our reputation from that standpoint is good. As for that going to extremes in this, where that we physically harm our children or do things that are beyond because of that things that they might have done that could take from our reputation, these are things that are excessive. That what we want in this is balance. As for being reviled and disparaged, yani people just saying bad things about you, short of it like really tarnishing your reputation, it is not an excuse to remain silent, for someone who commands what is right generally meets with it. This is the way of the prophets. Why? Because people have desires. And once someone desires something, it's easier to move what is in the heavens and the earth sometimes and to move that person away from what is they want to do when they desire something. This is human nature. When someone desires something, Ya Latif. Just think about when you really desire something. And then to move someone out of that and to like let go of that desire after really wanting something is one of the most difficult things of all for a human being to do. And when you all of a sudden are showing people a way that goes against what it is that they want, they're not going to like that. And thus think about all of the people that knew that the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet and true, but their desires got in the way. It goes against what they wanted. And this again shows the heart and the importance of the heart. And if we don't understand the heart and how desire relates to the heart, and one of the ways that you can understand this is that the qalb in this meaning is right here in the middle. And if you imagine a circle that also crosses and intersects with the circle of the heart, the nafs, which this aspect relates to the world in which we live here. The desires arrive within the nafs. And then imagine another circle over here that's also intersecting that circle of the heart. And imagine this being the unseen realm, and that being the ruh. Is that this all plays out on the heart. And the more that we we let the nafs win the battle, is that the more distant that we come from our ruh, our spirit, and the more polluted that our heart becomes. The more that we put the nafs in check, as well as those desires through regulating the desires that arise in it, the more victory that we'll give to the ruh, the spirit. And then the more heavenly and beautiful and pure the heart becomes. But if we just let things get into our heart, Ya Latif, they're very hard to get out. So problems means being beaten, killed, robbed, or acquiring a bad name in town. So this is that the details of being able to. Now, a couple other things that need to be discussed here is, and Imam will say, actually includes it as a condition, but then he says it's actually not really a condition. What is called adala, moral rectitude. As for requirements of moral rectitude, yani actually that living what it is that you're telling people not to do. Some scholars take this into consideration and say that a corrupt person is not entitled to censure, a position for which they adduce the word of Allah Most High. Do you enjoin piety to others and forget yourselves? But there are no grounds in the verse for such inference, as well as that other nusus in Imam al-Ghazali one by one gives an explanation of this particular verse and that a hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, and then a statement of Sayyidina Isa. And he says how none of these prove the point that even someone who's not as upright as they should be shouldn't take part in this. Now, one of the things that he does say is that if we look at the degrees which is coming of how we go about doing this, if it reaches the point where we need to speak very firmly, give an admonition, if someone is telling someone to do something that they're not doing, or they are a corrupt person of themselves, it's not going to be an effective way of doing it. So they have to be limited to the first stages. So there's nuance here. But in general, that moral rectitude, according to Imam Ghazali and other scholars, is not a prerequisite, even though it might not be as effective as someone who is seen to be upright. And then he deals with the issue of permission from the political authority. And of course, this is also, there's a lot of details to this depending upon that what we are talking about here. But definitely the early stages of this, explaining the wrong nature of the act, admonishing the person politely, and then moving to a higher degree of harshness, is that these are clearly permissible, and there's no need for permission for the political authority. Now, he's speaking in the context of living under the rule of Muslims, and there will be a little bit more added nuance here, how we implement this in our particular context here in the United States of America, which we'll get to this when we talk about in the afternoon session, and go into more detail during our interactive sessions, inshallah ta'ala, where this is where we want to really hit this home and how we can put this into practice in our context. And someone that is living in the inner city is very different than someone who is living in the suburbs. Someone who becomes Muslim in prison is very different than someone who is living outside. There's very different situations. And our approach and understanding to the Deen has to be broad enough, and that we have to be courageous enough to know that there are different approaches that might need to be taken given different circumstances and different situations. And we're in agreement on the principles, and that you can't do something that's going to bring about some type of harm on yourself. So if by doing something it leads you to being behind bars, then that's something that we're going to think twice about. But sometimes in certain situations, that not only do the authorities turn a blind eye, they actually use people of the community to help clean up certain neighborhoods. So that clearly has to be taken very differently than someone who that doesn't have that same experience in a different neighborhood. So some scholars stipulate that the person delivering the censure must have permission to do so from the caliph or his regional appointee, and do not grant that private individuals may censure others. This is untrue, Imam Ghazali says. For the Quranic verses and hadiths all indicate that whoever sees something wrong and does nothing has sinned. Stipulating that there must be permission from the caliph is mere arbitrary opinion. And so in other words is that we have to uphold this principle wherever it is that we are to the degree that we can. We have to uphold this blessed principle of religion wherever it is that we live, wherever time that is that we live in, to the degree that we can. And now obviously there's certain things we will not be able to do because we do not live in an Islamic state, in an Islamic country, and increasingly because there are so many different countries that are quote-unquote Islamic. Which ones of them are actually implementing that the sacred law anyway? That's a whole question in and of itself. So then he gets into the issue of a child in relation to his father. And that he says is that this is something that is required. That the child is entitled to explain the nature of the act, to admonish and advise his parents politely. And finally, may censure at the fourth level that if the situation that is appropriate for him to do this. So when we get into the levels, we'll come back to this. But in other words, is that sometime based upon relationships of authority, someone might be hesitant if you're in the workplace and that you are subordinate in the sense of your position to your boss or someone higher and up in the corporation. You have, according to the sacred law, if you see wrong, even though that their authority might stifle what it is that you're saying, you have to say something. The same thing goes for a student with their teacher or a child with their parent. And when we are speaking to people, though, that especially in the child-parent relationship, if they do something that is wrong, is that the child must say something, but there's a way of doing so. There's a way of doing it that would be differ were that young person be that forbidding a wrong that they see from a fellow friend. And there might be certain things that you don't do that you might do in a different situation. Okay, so there's a way of doing it. And in general, we always have to put gentleness that before anything else. So that's all we will say about this first bit, which is what? Losing my notes here. The person enjoining good and forbidding evil. So in the remaining 10 minutes, and it's a shorter discussion, we're going to talk about the thing that is forbade. The second integral of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong is that the thing censured is something blameworthy. So it has to be one, something that's blameworthy, two, that exists at present, and three, is apparent. So again, this gives us clarity on this matter. There's three conditions. If we're going to forbid something, some type of wrong, the thing that we're forbidding has to be blameworthy, it has to exist at present, and it has to be apparent. So as for this first bit, blameworthy means that its occurrence is prohibited by the sacred law, this being of wider scope than mere disobedience. Okay? And so, in other words, and this is where you'll get into some nuance, is that when we talk about Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, and this is an important point that we brought up in the session this morning, so we'll repeat it here. There's a wisdom why the first part is commanding to good and the second part is forbidding evil. Because one of the greatest ways, as one of our brothers mentioned, is that just by being Muslim in and of itself as that, is you are that actively forbidding wrong. Just by doing the right thing, you are calling people to the right thing by doing the right thing. So when you're doing the right thing in and of itself, that you are forbidding the wrong. And I was thinking when our brother was saying this earlier, he was just saying about the blessing of being Muslim, what a protection it is. And I had a flashback as he was speaking, because he is also a convert, of my own experience when I first converted. And for a few days that I was hanging out a little bit with some of my friends that were not yet Muslim. And it was just like, Ya Allah, the language, the things they were talking about, the things that was like, I just can't do this. I just can't do this, because you're going to get pulled right back into this life. And so you have to create a degree of separation. And when you're strong enough to still engage them such that it's actually da'wah, then that's very different. But to be pulled back into the things that you just left, that's not an option. You have to create a degree of separation. And the same thing applies if someone hasn't been in their deen and all their friends are Muslim, or they have Muslim and non-Muslim friends, but then they're getting back into the deen. Sometimes you got to separate yourself a little bit because people don't tend to let you change. So the blameworthy means that its occurrence is prohibited by the sacred. Sorry. So what I was saying there is that oftentimes in this discussion, the scholarly breakdown, what's emphasized more is forbidding the wrong. But we don't want to ever forget that establishing what is right, commanding the good, commanding what is right, first and foremost by living prophetically and following our Prophet ﷺ. This is the most important thing of all. And this is the greatest da'wah of all, is us simply being Muslim and upholding and living up to the incredibly high ethical standard of the Quran and that of our Prophet ﷺ. That is the greatest da'wah of all. Before we even say anything, that in and of itself, and this is why the word command is emphatic, will emphatically impact people around you in ways that you don't realize, although they might not ever say it, and it might take some time, but it will impact people that are around you, guaranteed. And anyone that's had non-Muslim family members knows this firsthand, but it takes time. Anyone that's had that relationships with other people will see this over a period of time. Now, I'm not saying that everybody will become Muslim. People have a choice in the end, but it impacts people. So let's never neglect this part. When we talk about this principle, we need to spend just as much time speaking about how we can actually command the good and be examples. And when Allah says, وَاجْعَلْنِي لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا, bless me to be an imam of the pious. In other words, is that you rush to do good, that people follow you because they see you doing good, not that you're designing leadership. You're a leader in good. And when you do that, people will benefit and they will follow. So let's not forget that, because in this breakdown, we're primarily focusing on the forbidding the wrong part. But in our conception, that actually is the first part. And that's the greatest way to get people out of wrong, is to that preoccupy them with good. And it's from here that they say is that one of the greatest functions of the awliya is just to keep people out of trouble. Of the awliya, one of their greatest functions is just to keep people out of trouble. One of the great Imams, Imam Bakr al-Adi, from the Kibar of the awliya and the Salihin, he used to give a wage to a large number of young people during his time, and the only stipulation for them, their work, was just to spend time with him at night, so that they wouldn't end up doing all the stuff that they were doing were they not to be in his presence. Just the fact that we're here, there's a protection from a lot of other places that we could be pulled. And it's from here we can understand the other. One time there was someone that complained that he was remembering Allah, but he wasn't concentrating when he was remembering. And this scholar corrected him by saying, Ihmadillah, praise Allah, that he adorned one of your limbs with an act of obedience. Meaning that if you're remembering Allah, even if you're not concentrating, of course, we should work on ourselves and try to concentrate. But it's better, at least you're not saying something that's haram. At very least. So when we understand that this has opened up a door for us of finding ways to really engage people at our time with realistic expectations to prevent worse things that could be happening, because that's really where we're at. And at the same time, having micro environments of faith and practice and companionship that, despite the greater time and what most people are in, that hopefully will produce great people that are scholars and very pious. This is possible right here in this soil. And anyone who doesn't think it's possible, then I think you just need to correct the way you see things. This is possible. Not because of us, but as-Saqi Baqi, Allah, that He is the Hayyul Qayyum. And if he wants to give, he gives. And if he wants to withhold, he withholds. But no one can prevent what he gives, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So blameworthy means its occurrence is prohibited in the sacred law. So this includes that which is haram as well as that which is also disliked. And again, that prohibiting the wrong has, insofar as it is haram, whether it is a major sin or minor sin, is one thing, but still you can guide people that to not do what is also disliked. Just as you can that tell people what to do when it's obligation, and also out of concern for them, that encourage them to do what is recommended. But it has a different legal ruling, but it's a part of the same reality. And it gets very nuanced. But at the same time, we need to put things in our proper place and to make priorities. But sometimes, even when people are really caught up, we actually encourage them to do small acts of goodness. So that in doing that small act of goodness, it's a means to have them open up a great door of good. And someone actually mentioned that this morning. And there was someone who was robbing caravans. And then they found some juice, and one of the brigands said, do you want some, to the lead, the head of them? He says, no, I'm fasting. You're fasting and you're robbing a caravan? And his response was, I didn't want to close every door between myself and Allah. That same person saw that head bandit in Mecca years later doing tawaf. And he said, I left the door open and my Lord accepted me. So encourage people just to do any type of good. Sometimes that's what it is that we have to do. So then it has to be something that is blameworthy if we're censuring it. But this is why that the word used here was munkar, because this includes everything that we know to be wrong, whether that it's wrong insofar as it's punishable if we were to do it, i.e. the haram, but also that things like the makruh, the dislike, which also bring darkness to the heart. And that it exists at present. That exists at present excludes someone who has done some act of disobedience and is no longer doing it. Okay? So what remains there, if someone had already done something, then this is where that you advise them. So you're not stopping anything because they're not doing it actively in the moment. This is where you advise them. It also excludes something which will take place later, as when there is evidence that a person intends, I use the example of drinking, intends to go drinking that night. There is no censure in such cases other than to appeal to the person's conscience because they haven't done it yet. So it gets very detailed here. You're not stopping anything because they haven't done it. Here, you want to remind them. And it is apparent. Apparent excludes someone who conceals his disobedience at home and locks his door. It is not permissible to spy on him. So what we're really trying to protect then is that the general polity, that the broader community, is that when things become widespread and people see thing doing all different types of wrong publicly, it makes it so much easier for people to then do those things, let alone when they're advertised, let alone when they're called to, and the way they are in a society like the one that we live in. But this is really important. So then Imam al-Ghazali says that وَقَدْ أَمَرَنَا بِأَن نَسْتُرَ مَا سَتَرَ اللَّهُ. We have been commanded to conceal what Allah has concealed. وَنُنْكَرْ عَلَى مَنْ أَبْدَلَنَا صَفْحًا. But we speak out against those who publicly do it in front of other people. And then there's degrees to which that we come to know things. So tajassus, spying on people, is unlawful. And he says, وَمَعْنَى tajassus طَلَبَ الْأَمَارَاتِ. It's that you're looking for signs of them doing wrong that indicate that they're doing wrong. That's something we can't do. And again, this is a fine line in these matters, and we have to implement this, that not just with communities, but also in our own homes. And then finally, there's one last point here, and we've already gone over time. One may not condemn another for questions involving differences amongst schools of jurisprudence. So the general principle states, لا إنكار في مختلف فيه إنما الإنكار على ما أجمع عليه العلماء. You cannot make inkar of something and condemn a wrong that there is a difference of opinion about. You can only do this in relation to what has been established by consensus of the scholars. Now, there are some details when it comes to that, and this doesn't mean that anyone can just take any opinion what they want at any time. And if someone is that openly following one school and in certain matters, that they just say, hey, I'm going to just take this opinion in this particular affair, because in this school that you don't need a wali in order to get married, so I'm just going to take, this is where that we can speak openly against that, as opposed to someone taking another opinion because there's some type of need or necessity. That's a very different situation. The general ruling is that we don't make inkar, we don't condemn a wrong unless that it is agreed upon. In Imam al-Ghazali's words, إن يكون كونه منكر بغير اجتهاد. It's not an opinion that arises from the legal reasoning, the independent legal reasoning of a particular imam. And so one of the things that we can do, and this is why I asked for this book to be brought, The Reliance of the Traveler, may Allah bless and preserve its author. He has a beautiful section here. And so almost everything that I just mentioned was taken from Sheikh Noor's, that translation, and I'll explain here briefly. But there's, if you go to section, the section Q of Reliance of the Traveler, this is a book that everyone should have in their library. Book Q is on commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. And the reason that we just focused on this, because the discussion announced that follow are Imam al-Ghazali's edited, this is Imam al-Ghazali's, this is basically a summary of chapter 2. How was it summarized? It was edited by the great Hanbali scholar Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi from an earlier abridgment of Imam al-Ghazali Iḥyā Ulūm by Imam Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi, and that which Imam al-Maqdisi shortened, and so that it summarizes the most important principles it is that we need. Imam al-Ghazali goes into a lot more detail, but for our purposes, this suffices. And so there's a summary of the obligation to command the right, and you can have that, you see that there. And then the four that integrals are also all there. So I highly recommend that people reference this. Now, the other thing that's also very helpful about having this book is book P is the Kitab al-Kibar on enormities. And so then this is where when we look here, these are things that we can understand. These are the things that we really need to be speaking out against. Killing a human being, that sorcery, not performing the prayer, not paying zakat, showing disrespect to that one's parents, accepting riba, lying about the Prophet ﷺ, wrongfully consuming an orphan's property, and so forth and so on, breaking one's fast in Ramadan, drinking, fornication, and things of this nature. These are things that it's very clear. But the other thing that's also very helpful here, there's a longer section, W52, which is Sheikh Ibn Hajar al-Haytami's book, taken from his book Az-Zawajir. He lists the various enormities, because there's difference opinion amongst the scholars. What are the major sins? Yani the enormities. And so he mentions here 420, I believe, 442 rather, of in a broader understanding of what could be considered to be an enormity. Now, what this does for us is it gives us a knowledge of the things that we need to avoid. And asking about evil so that we can avoid it is a good thing. But it also will help us in that this process of enjoining good and forbidding evil in terms of the priorities. These are the main things that we want to really focus on. As for the issues where there's difference of opinion on, is that as long as it's not leading to a greater harm, that there's room there for people to take legal dispensations from the other schools insofar as it's needed or insofar as it's a necessity. And I hope that makes sense, and that will conclude our discussion bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Any questions you have, please make note of them. We will have about an hour for the men and an hour for the sisters to discuss in detail, and so please save them for then bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.